The strategy that I'm going to teach today is graphic organizers. What graphic organizers are visual devices that employ shapes as ways to help students organize information. The purpose of graphic organizers is to help students, again, visually organize information. Students can use them as visual cues to facilitate organization of information that they're learning or thinking that they're doing. Specifically with reading comprehension, graphic organizers help students remember text structures or can teach vocabulary words. Graphic organizers help written expression by allowing students to organize their writing. And finally, specifically, it helps content area learning by helping students understand the relationship between ideas or, again, new vocabulary that they need to learn. And again, it shows how students, it shows the students how information and ideas are organized and related, and emphasis on the word show because, again, it's a visual representation of information. The specific graphic organizer that I'm going to teach today is the comparison matrix. And what a comparison matrix does is it's used to compare two or more subjects based off a set of characteristics. So as you see here, you have the subjects in the first column that you might be comparing and the characteristics that you want to look at for each subject across the top. For my comparison matrices, when I use them with my 11th graders, I also like to add a summary on the end column in the bottom row, and that really helps the students to synthesize the information that they're learning. So across this row, you would summarize what this subject looks like across characteristics, and on this column, you would summarize what this characteristic looks like in each of these three subject areas. I use this strategy all the time. I have 3 examples here from my last 3 units. The first one was with World War II. We looked at the question, how did different minority groups contribute to World War II on the home front and at war? And as you see, I have the different minority groups listed here in the first column, and the characteristics I'm looking at, their participation at home and their participation at war, listed across the top. I don't have a summarized column on the end here to look at the summary of the different groups, but I do have the students summarize all minority participation at home and all minority participation at war at the bottom. Another one I've used, this is from my last unit. We talked about what are the differences in the way Cold War superpowers were run economically and politically. What I like about this strategy is that you can also use it to present information. So this might be something that I've given students just as a way to help them organize the information. So you have the United States' economic system, which is capitalism, the United States' political system, which is democracy, the Soviet Union's economic system, which was communism, and the Soviet Union's political system, which was a dictatorship. And again, you can see that for this content, I did not have the students summarize at the bottom or on the side, which is perfectly fine. You can leave that out whenever you want. And the last one that I want to show you is one that I actually used just yesterday about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and we had the students look at each of the leaders' early lives, the people that influenced them, the philosophy that they have, the civil rights accomplishments that they had, and then any civil rights associates that they had. And again, you can either add the summary column or not. So to model, I wanted to use something that we're all familiar with. So the question that I'm going to look at is, what should I eat before class? And it's something that I struggle with every Thursday. I'm going to add the subjects here, so that would be the type of restaurant, the characteristics up top, and then we'll fill in, and then at the bottom we'll summarize after we fill them all in. So the subjects that I've chosen are Noodles & Company, Wendy's, and Food from Home. The characteristics that I've chosen are to look at are cost, accessibility, and tastiness. The first thing that you want to do is have the students fill out the first row. So the cost of Noodles & Company is $15. The accessibility is walk in, it takes about 10 minutes, and it's super tasty. So my summary is Noodles & Company is a tasty option if I have time and money to spend. And then you'll have your students fill in the other rows that you have. And then finally, you have the students summarize each column once you have this all filled in. So the cost of each of them, the summary of that is I have options for all price ranges. And then you would fill in the other two. I like to have students fill it out by row, but as they get more comfortable with it, if you gave the students a reading, for example, or talked about the cost of all restaurants, then you might have them fill out the columns this way and then summarize here at the end. It just depends on what you want. So I have Kathy here for a demonstration. She's my co-teacher and teaches government and United States and Virginia history, so we're going to look at some examples that she might be able to use.
So Kathy, when do you think that you could use this strategy in your classes? I can think of a couple of different ways. So in USVA history, you could use this if you wanted to make comparisons about have the different colonies, so the ones in the north, the ones in the middle, and the ones in the south. For your government student. For government, I was thinking branches of government. You could break it down into what the legislative branch does, the executive branch, and then the judicial branch. Okay. So if you were creating this for your students, you would want to first give the graph a title. So I was going to title it the branches of government. Okay. Okay, and then, so across the left-hand side, I would say the categories would be the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And then for the two categories here, I was going to do duties and responsibilities. So what do those branches each do? And then checks and balances, how do they check each other? Okay. So the first thing that you would then do is have your students or yourself fill out the top row. Sure. So for duties and responsibilities for the legislative branch, they're making laws. So obviously you have the two houses. You have the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they're involved in everything from treaty approval to any time the president makes any sort of appointment, they have to run an investigation and then approve or deny the appointment, such as one that is coming up that comes to mind is replacing Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. So anytime that he makes an appointment, they need to conduct an investigation. So they're doing a lot of issue research, a lot of background with bills and so forth in order to make those laws. And they get checked, for example, by the judicial branch. The judicial branch is checking them to make sure that the laws that they actually come up with, that they're actually constitutional. We call that judicial review. So that would be a way that they get checked. So I can say that they get checked by the judicial branch, and it's through judicial review. Okay. And then you would summarize the legislative branch. Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, they make the laws. Okay. And then you would include somehow the checks and balances in that summary as well. Okay, so you wanted to say that they make the laws and that they're checked by the judicial branch. Perfect. Okay. So for the executive branch is making sure that these laws are carried out. The executive branch is comprised of the president, the vice president, the cabinet, and all of those that work in those departments that are part of the cabinet. Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and so on and so forth. So in that way, they are carrying out these laws to make sure that they're enforced and adhered to. So their checks are done, again, by judicial branch, can check them through cases that come through the courts, whether they're following the law. For example, Miranda rights are a perfect example of that. We now have Miranda rights because of the case that was brought forward to the judicial system, Miranda. So for a summary for that, I would say that the executive branch enforces the laws and again is checked by the judicial branch in that example. So, and then for the judicial branch, we would say that their main job, obviously, is to interpret laws. And the way that they do that is by hearing cases and then conducting what is known as judicial review. So, whether or not a law is constitutional is what their responsibility for determination is. Now, sometimes the Supreme Court will have a judicial restraint sort of slant, where they're really interpreting things to the letter of the law and what is specifically written in the Constitution. Sometimes, instead of a judicial restraint slant, they'll have a judicial activist sort of slant. And that will lead to justices taking into account more of the issues of the day, so to speak. So what is an issue in society? For example, right now we could say gay marriage is something that is a big issue in society today, especially within the United States. So they're reviewing these laws for constitutionality, so we definitely want to include all of that. And then their checks and balances. For example, legislative branch can check the judicial branch by approving the nominees that the president brings forward or denying them. They can also impeach justices that are on the Supreme Court and remove them from office. It's a rarity, but it's certainly allowable constitutionally. And so in these ways, we can say that the legislative branch is checking judicial. So for our summary, I would say that it interprets the laws, the judicial branch does, and that their checks and balances can occur from the legislative branch in those ways that we talked about. Okay. And those summaries are really good because you have really in-depth specific information here, and then you summarize it pretty succinctly at the end. Right. Okay. So the last step is summarizing the duties across the branches. So in a democracy, in order to make things run efficiently and effectively, we need to have laws. And so the legislative branch makes those, the executive branch carries them out, the judicial branch interprets them. And so as a whole, these three branches, among other things, they allow our democratic society to function without chaos. And that having these checks and balances in place the way that we do allows the system to work without there being some sort of power issue or lack of balance between them. Kind of the way I like to look at it and explain it to students is the engine of allowing our society to function is lubricated by or made possible through checks and balances. Perfect. Thank you so much. Sure.
So as I said, I think this is a really effective strategy, and I think that you can use it in a variety of different ways with a bunch of different students. I think that you can use it in elementary school. I think that you can use it in middle school, and I think that you can use it in high school. And I think that you can use it really in any subject. For math, if you're comparing shapes, you could use it. Science, and you can use it in so many ways, comparing rocks or chemicals. Social studies, you saw the different ways that I've used it, and the way that government can use it in English. If you want to compare literature, you can do that too. So I think that this chart is good for math at any level. I think this chart is good for science at any level, social studies at any level, and English at any level. And I think that this is a good chart for any subject in elementary school, any subject in middle school, and any subject in high school. If you are going to use this, you can use it really before, during, or after note-taking when you're presenting information. To make it effective, it must be used consistently so the students can kind of make it a habit and can generalize it across subjects. Make sure that the chart is appropriate for your students, and we're going to look at some ways that you can modify it or scaffold it for different ages. One way that you can do that is by, again, eliminating the summary table or the summary row and column like I have in some of my examples before. You can, if you want to make it a little more complex, you can add as many subjects or as many characteristics as you want. And these don't have to be equal. You don't have to have 3 characteristics and 3 subjects. It's just what I did here. If you want your students, and I love this step, you can have them summarize the information. And another thing that you can do is add guiding questions. So one thing that I did for my minorities in World War II is, for example, I had questions under the at war column that said what were their jobs at war, did they make up any specific groups in the military, such as like the Tuskegee Airmen or the Waves, how were they treated, you can look at payment, you can look at a bunch of different things, but these guiding questions are ways that you can help hone in on the information that's important or that you want the students to get down. And the last modification is you can have students actually fill in the characteristics that you want them to learn. So if you give them a reading about these 3 subjects, they can come up with characteristics that might be similar or different across the subjects. For the intensity of instruction, you can really, again, use this with any grade level, any depth of information. So you can have the students fill out a very detailed chart based on a detailed reading, or you can just kind of use one-word comparisons. You need to make sure that you teach the purpose, the description of the graphic organizer, and allow students to understand when to use the specific graphic organizer. Like we said, there's a ton of different ones, so making sure students know when to use what. Modeling is super important. Make sure that you use a content that is familiar with them for some content scaffolding first, and then they can use it with information, with new content that they don't know. Make sure you're using it consistently, and the work for you would be creating the organizers and then the creation of the material to fill out the organizer. So I hope that this is something that you can find useful in your classroom, and if you have any questions, you can ask me.